The SAVE Act, solving a problem with the efficiency of a group project where no one bothered to read the assignment. Welcome back to Beyond the Bill Number, where we believe policy is personal, voting rights are vital, and sometimes a bill's biggest problem is that they're trying to fix something that ain't broke. I'm Sarah.
And I'm Stephen, back to break down a bill that's got more red flags than a minefield hosting a Soviet parade during Chinese New Year. Today we're talking about the SAVE Act. Yes, that's short for Safeguard American Voter Eligibility, but don't let the name fool you.
Right. It sounds like a superhero movie, The SAVE Act, Democracy in Peril. But in reality, it's more like a complicated DMV form disguised as electoral reform. So before we kick things off, let's take on our international lens again and talk about UK voter registration. And is there a way that changing your last name or name in general can impact your ID and your ability to vote in the UK? And one of my other questions, I know you don't have social security numbers there, you have your national health number, but are birth certificates as important as they are there? So those are all my questions for you, our international guru.
Yeah. Yes. So obviously the American system is based very closely on the British system. So we do have similar issues in that we have a similar antipathy towards any kind of national ID card. So in most countries there is a national ID card. So these problems don't arise because it's the law in a lot of countries that you have to carry your ID card on you wherever you go. And obviously a lot of people probably don't. I doubt you get punished very harshly if you don't. But it's still there. So asking people to show their ID card when they vote is perfectly normal and reasonable. But it's hard in countries like ours where we don't have that because what kind of ID can you use? So in Britain, up until about 5 or 6 years ago, we had a very simple system, really. So what happened was every year you got a letter from the local council and they said, we think that these are the eligible voters living in your house. And it was just a quick list. And they said, if that's right, then fine, you don't need to do anything. But if anything's changed, then you can either fill out this form and post it back to us, you can call us on this number, or you can go online and use these codes and just make the change yourself. So it's very, very simple. A really easy system. It took like 2 minutes when you needed to make a change. And most of the time, obviously, you didn't because people living in your house are the same. And then a couple of weeks before polling day, you get a big white card through the post like that. And it says, okay, this is the election. This is who's been elected. This is your polling station. These are the times and things. And then you just turn up to the polling station, you take your card, but you don't even need to be honest. And the polling station is always a 5 minute walk from your house. So it's literally a 5 minute walk to the polling station. There's never a queue because the process is so quick. So you just walk in and you say to the guy on the desk, I live at this house and this is my name. He looks down a list, crosses it off with a pen, gives you a polling card. You go into a little box, put a cross in a box on the polling card with a pencil, and then you fold it up and you stick it in a ballot box and you walk out. So the whole process from leaving your house to getting back to your house to vote takes 15 minutes maximum.
Okay, that sounds like a paradise. I have to laugh because every single election, I always donate money to a organization called Pizza to the Polls that delivers pizza to people in line because their poll stations make them wait for hours and hours and hours. And that's like one of the things that I always donate to. And 15 minutes? Like you can't walk anywhere to...
At least, yes. I know, it's crazy. Now, that is in a city, of course. If you're in rural areas, then it's a little bit different, but it's still not that much different. You're still talking, maybe you need to drive to your polling station, and maybe it might take you half an hour, but you never have to queue, and the polling station is always quite convenient. And that was the process. Now, interestingly, though, if you look at the number of people who vote in the UK, the proportion of people who vote in the UK compared to the US, it's about the same. So my surprise is how anybody votes in America. I'm amazed anybody does. You must all be absolute titans of democracy to actually fight through such a complicated system to vote. Now, Boris Johnson, a few years back, he did make it more difficult because he was looking at the US and he thought the US system is fantastic. So let's copy that. So he introduced voter ID rules. So now when you turn up, you have to take ID with you. It needs to be a driver's license, a passport, something like that. And that was very, very controversial because just like in the US, there's no evidence of any kind of identity fraud in elections. It just does not happen, right? People do not turn up to the polls pretending to be somebody else. It just doesn't happen. There's little bits of voter fraud. You know, it's often like students voting twice, you know, voting where they go to college as well as voting at home or something like that. But it's really rare. Doesn't happen very much. There was a big scandal in Birmingham where I live around postal voting when they introduced postal voting, probably about 10 years ago now. And then afterwards they did, some analysis on it and found out that there was quite widespread fraud going on. It really surprised everybody, and they pretty much stopped it. Then they tightened up all the rules and things. So very few people vote by post because it's just not necessary.
Wow.
If it's so quick, why would you bother? Like my mom does, just because she doesn't want to go down to the polling station. So elderly people might do it or whatever, but most people don't.
Was the fraud people stealing people's ballots out of their mailboxes, or what was that?
I can't remember now. I know everyone was really surprised because it was just something that no one thinks about, right? It's just voter fraud in elections. It doesn't. I mean, the main thing is just trying to get people to turn up and vote.
Right,
That's the challenge.
Right.
It's not about combating voter fraud. So it was a big surprise. I can't remember the details of it now, but it was something to do with the actual process was flawed in terms of actually sending the ballots in. So somehow people were able to vote. I don't think it actually affected the results of the elections in any way, though, as voter fraud hardly ever does. Well, it never does.
It's interesting because I always laugh at the conversation in the US about voter fraud and people thinking there's so much mischievous stuff at foot because they just make it so hard to vote. Like, are people really going to try to do it more than one time or try to do all this crazy stuff because it is so hard to vote here. We only mail vote in my house. We go and drop it off in person. We don't put it in the mail. We just drop it out a ballot box. But it's way easier to do. We can take our time with the ballot. We can do our research. It's really nice.
When I think about it, there are some essential flaws in the argument that this is a real problem. The first one being that, as you've already alluded to, imagine that I wanted to commit voter fraud and maybe vote twice. Maybe even 3 times in an election where millions of votes are being cast. What difference is that going to make? I mean, the big problem with voting is, particularly in America, if you live in 90% of the country, your vote in a presidential election has absolutely no impact on the result, right? That is one of the big problems.
Thanks to gerrymandering.
So why would you bother? Well, yeah, but also just vote to the electoral college, right? If you live in California, it doesn't matter who you vote for, frankly. So there's no incentive then to commit voter fraud in the vast majority of the country. And the penalties for it are already so harsh and the reward is so low. It just doesn't work like that. And then the idea in particular that people really want to do this, I mean, is it some giant Democrat conspiracy to steal votes away from the Republicans?
We're not doing a good job.
Exactly. They're losing elections, so it's not. It's clearly not working very well. It's just what is the essential motivation between these ideas that this widespread voter fraud is going on? What is the objective of the people who are doing it? Particularly when you start talking about immigrants voting, which obviously we're just about to. So really, all of those immigrants coming across the border into the US, they're actually going to break the law and go to a polling station and vote because of what? Why? What is their incentive? Surely they want to get a job and work and not get kicked out. That would be their priority. It wouldn't be voting, would it?
Right.
Yeah. Let's just design a good voter fraud system now, right? So in most races, even quite local small races, the margins of victory are in the thousands, right? At the very least, if not hundreds of thousands. So to actually have an impact, you would need a system that could skew these votes hundreds of thousands of votes, right? So there's no practical way to do that by actual individuals voting twice or 3 times or whatever. You'd need so many people involved. There's no way you'd get away with it, right? So it would have to be some sort of centralized system. And this is sort of what was accused in the last presidential election, where there were whole ballot boxes full of these fake votes being put into the system. And that is really what you'd have to do if you were to influence it. But it's almost impossible to do that in practical ways because it's so easy to prevent that kind of fraud. And obviously the penalties for that will be so harsh. You go to prison for such a long time that there's no practical way to do it. And who is doing this? Who's the organization behind this? I mean, are we seriously accusing a major political party of organizing this kind of nationwide voter fraud? And again, because each election in America is completely different, works in completely different ways, and is organized by completely different groups of people, influencing a national election in that way, again, it's just unthinkable, sort of impossible, really. So the practicalities of it don't really stack up.
Well, it is Pizza to the Polls that's doing that, just in case you wanted to know.
Is it you
No,
put a little
that's what they're saying. They're
ballot paper
saying
into the
feeding
pizza
people
as it
in
goes, yeah.
line is going to make them vote a specific way. And it's like, well, if someone's waiting 3 hours in line, they've made up their mind. They're not
Yeah.
like going to be easily swayable.
I mean, pizzas tend to be red, don't they? So surely the incentive would be
Oh my gosh,
to vote Republican rather than Democrat. You don't get
gotta
blue
get some of
pizzas, do
the
you?
blue cheese on the pizza. Then
Yeah, blue
it'll be
cheese
even,
pizza.
like, yeah. The whole thing is kind of crazy, and I feel like talking about if the red pizza is gonna, influence people is a great segue for us to get into today, because my goodness, where are we? What is this timeline? And I want to get off this ship. So let's start with the basics. Stephen, what does the SAVE Act actually do?
So, at its core, then, the SAVE Act proposes an amendment to the National Voter Registration Act of 1993, which requires documentary proof of US citizenship to register for federal elections. So, we already know there are lots and lots of laws around voter ID at the polls, but this is taking a step further. It's talking about actually proving you are a US citizen to register for an election. So in that early stage of the process. So the kind of ID that would be acceptable, think passports, real ID compliant driver's licenses, military IDs with birth records attached, or a birth certificate paired with government issued photo ID. So it's all quite complicated. And that's not all, though. The bill goes further than that. It also mandates states to verify citizenship status through new systems, encourages data sharing between federal and state agencies, and, here's the particular kicker, adds criminal penalties for election officials who mistakenly register non-citizens.
So this is not just a tweak of the existing process, we could say. This is a whole structural overhaul. And it has no funding, by the way, and no grace period, and just no resources. It is essentially a figure it out states. And that is an approach, but I have a bigger question. Is this actually solving a real problem? Because this sounds like a massive lift to address something that I just don't know if it's there.
Well, I mean, so there's two ways to look at it. The short answer is no. The long answer is absolutely not.
Oh.
As we've already discussed, every reputable study we have from the Brennan Center, the Migration Policy Institute, even the Conservative Heritage Foundation shows that non-citizen voting is vanishingly rare. So let's just take a look at some of those numbers because they bear some scrutiny. So in the 2016 election, out of 23.5 million votes studied, suspected non-citizen votes were 0.0001% of the total vote cast. So an infinitesimally small proportion. So the Heritage Foundation's had a bee in its bonnet about this for a long time, and it's set up this whole project to monitor all of this voter fraud that's going on. And so even though they are desperately trying to find evidence for voter fraud, they identified only 23 cases of non-citizen voting across 2 decades of elections.
Oh my gosh.
So all of those different elections. State level audits, places like Texas, Arizona, and Georgia, again, they really went in looking for this voter fraud. They found fewer than 50 cases per state out of millions of votes cast. And don't forget, there's also no evidence to show that it is these perfidious Dems doing all of the virtually non-existent voter fraud. The handful of cases where it does actually happen tend to split pretty evenly between the two parties, actually. So they effectively cancel each other out. Not that the number of dodgy votes could in any way actually swing any of these particular races because the numbers of votes are so small compared to the margins of victory, which almost always are in many thousands of votes.
Yeah, I remember in the last election, I read some article about the voter fraud that they identified, and everybody on there was voting for Trump. And I was like, well, here we are. So could have been selective reporting. That's not even statistical noise. That's like a rounding error. So there's no fraud to be stopped. But what does this bill actually do?
Well, what it does do is create massive barriers for eligible voters. So according to the Bipartisan Policy Center, over 21 million Americans, which is 9% of the voting age population, don't have a proof of citizenship that's readily available. So that includes groups of people such as college students, people experiencing homelessness, naturalized citizens, women who've changed their name after marriage, and people born in rural areas without easy access to birth records. So in Arizona, which already tried this kind of requirement back in 2004, the rule didn't catch non-citizens. Instead, it disenfranchised people like those in transient living situations, also students and folks without any kind of stable housing.
So, if the goal was to really protect voting, it's mostly making it harder for people to vote who already have the hardest time voting, or people who are just doing stuff like changing their name when they get married. I mean, this is just interesting. To me, that sounds like a form of disenfranchisement, if I've ever heard one.
Well, it does, doesn't it? And you would think that given that this is very much a Republican project, that the sort of perfidious aim of this is to disenfranchise Democrat voters. And when you look at the kind of people who are disenfranchised, you might say, oh, yes, that's true. But actually, it's interesting that a lot of these people these days in particular will be voting for Donald Trump or will be voting the Republicans. And so they're also disenfranchising their own voters. Now, I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it's certainly something that you would think would make them think a little bit.
Right. And it's also, I mean, part of it, as a married person, I had to change my passport, and I actually had a lot of issues because they kept spelling my name wrong. So I had to send my passport in 3 different times, which meant that I had to pay to send my passport in 3 different times so that my passport matched my social security number name, but none of it matches my birth certificate now. And it was a lot of money and time. And a lot of people also talk about this not even being a form of disenfranchisement, but also a poll tax, because it's like $200 to get a passport and a lot of time and effort. And especially when the passport business is not processing passports correctly, and you might have to send yours in 3 times to get it correct. Like, here we are.
Yeah.
But anyways, okay, let's talk about the implementation here. So say this bill passes, how realistic is it that the states could actually pull something like this off?
Well, incredibly unrealistic, really. And it is worth really examining the practicalities of this sort of sweeping change to law. So the SAVE Act gives states absolutely no money and absolutely no time to completely overhaul their voter registration systems. It goes into effect immediately and gives the Election Assistant Commission just 10 days to issue guidance. So we're talking about changing how people register, how IDs are verified, how voter rolls are maintained, all without any kind of funding. Some states don't even have the technical infrastructure to verify citizenship reliably, and forcing agencies to suddenly share data opens up privacy, accuracy, and logistical nightmares. So if the purpose of this act is to increase public confidence in the American voting system, it's very unlikely to actually achieve that aim because there will be chaos.
That literally is a logistical nightmare. And we've actually seen what happens when this goes sideways, which, how often can we learn from our mistakes and choose to not? But in Texas, in 2019, the Secretary of State flagged 95,000 voters as possible non-citizens, and it turned out that most of them, in fact, were citizens. And that debacle led to a resignation, not to cleaner voter rolls. So what should we be doing instead? What could we be doing that shows that we might have actually learned something from a past mistake?
Well, we could learn from things that haven't been mistakes. So there are some smart data-driven options available. So Colorado, for example, uses daily updates from the DMV to keep voter rolls accurate. Sounds very sensible. The Bipartisan Policy Center suggests states could expand access to federal eligibility data and automate updates without burdening voters. So these options maintain election integrity without requiring people to dig through storage for their birth certificates or miss a deadline because they were waiting on a passport that hasn't come back after the 3rd time they've sent it in.
And don't forget, it's 8 to 12 weeks between each time. So
It's 8 to 12 weeks.
Okay, there has been a lot of news about this act. This is something that has been incredibly pervasive in the news cycles. So let's just get on a solid foundation really quick. What is the current status of the SAVE Act?
Well, people might remember that we covered the SAVE Act before in the last Congress, and then it was like never going to pass. But then, of course, we had a Democrat Senate, didn't we? This time round, the Republicans control both houses of Congress, and the SAVE Act actually passed the House in April 2025. The vote was largely along party lines, but 4 Democrats did join the Republicans to pass it. inexplicably. And it's now in the Senate. And Senator Mike Lee has also introduced a companion bill. So, with the Republicans in control of both chambers and Trump back in the White House, the bill really has momentum, particularly because the Republicans have put this on a list of their top 12 bills that they want to pass in this session. So, there really is a lot of force behind this. But we need to bear in mind that in the Senate, if the Democrats choose to filibuster this, which they may well, it would need 60 votes to overcome that filibuster. And that does seem really unlikely, for now at least.
Okay, but the fact that this has gotten so far says a lot about where this conversation is heading and kind of what's at stake for our future elections.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, to wrap it all up, this bill takes an extremely rare situation, that of people pretending to be somebody else to vote, people who aren't Americans pretending to be Americans so they could vote, and responds to it with sweeping legislation that could keep millions of legitimate voters from participating, all under the guise of security. So it's a bit like hiring armed guards to protect your house from squirrel burglars that don't actually exist.
I will say I do have a squirrel problem in my backyard. They love the grapes that grow there, and I might need an armed guard or two. But
yeah, does it break in though and steal your stuff?
They do get a little aggressive sometimes when we try to have dinner out there and they're trying to eat the grapes. But live and let live, live and let live. Okay, well. While election integrity is a very worthy goal, it shouldn't come at the cost of access, accuracy, or the democracy itself, especially not as we're headed towards America's 250th anniversary, a moment that should be about expanding participation and not restricting it.
250 years. Wow, your country is so old.
We're very young. We're just little babies.
Yes, absolutely. Well, if you liked today's episode, subscribe and leave us a review, and I promise you won't need a passport to validate that review. And don't forget to check out the full blog post and all the resources we mentioned at BillTrack50.com.
We'll catch you next week, and hopefully not to tackle the next bill that's trying to do too much, too fast, with too little evidence. But until then, keep questioning, keep voting, and keep looking beyond that bill number.